kerosene lamp glowing on the table, a little past 2 in the morning. That single small flame lights the room, steady in the still night air, throwing soft, flickering shadows that stretch and shift across the walls. A father stands over a worn family Bible, its cover softened by years of use, thumbed through so many times that the leather itself seems to carry the weight of the household's history. His voice trembles just slightly as he prepares to swear in the President of the United States, his own son. To understand why that lamp was even burning at such an hour, you have to back up a few hours, to an ordinary summer evening that gave no hint of what was coming. Calvin Coolidge, Vice President of the United States, was spending the summer at home in Plymouth Notch, Vermont, a village so small and so quiet that his father's farmhouse didn't have electricity or even a telephone. Up there, days moved at the pace of the farm itself, measured out in chores and weather rather than schedules and headlines. He was there to sit on the porch in the cool evening air as the light faded over the hills, to be, for a few weeks, just a Vermont farmer's son again, far from the noise and formality of the capital. So when history came calling that night, it didn't arrive by wire straight to the house, the way you might expect news of such magnitude to travel in the nation's capital. It came the only way it could, given where he was, a message telephoned to nearby Bridgewater, written down, then carried by automobile in the dark, up the quiet road to a farmhouse lit by lamps. Someone had to drive that road themselves, knock, and deliver news too large for the hour, news that no one in that sleeping house had any reason to expect, and it carried news no one there had planned for, news that would upend the calm of that summer in an instant, turning an ordinary night on an ordinary farm into something the whole country would remember. Word had come from the other side of the country. President Warren Harding, on a long trip west, had died suddenly and unexpectedly that evening in San Francisco, apparently of a stroke, far from home, far from the family and capital he served. In that instant, roughly 2,600 miles away, in a farmhouse with no phone of its own, cut off from the rest of the country by nothing more than distance and darkness, the Vice President of the United States became the President of the United States. The Constitution said so, plainly and immediately. The office simply passed, without delay, without ceremony required, the moment one man's life ended. But it left behind a question nobody in that little house had ever had to answer before. Out here, in the middle of the night, far from any hall of government, with no federal official anywhere nearby, who was even authorized to administer the oath. Because the man Coolidge would turn to was not a Supreme Court justice, not a cabinet officer, not anyone in Washington at all. He was Coolidge's own father, John Calvin Coolidge Sr., known around Plymouth Notch as Colonel Coolidge, a title of respect rather than military rank, earned through years as a fixture of the community, the kind of man whose name carried weight simply because everyone in the village had known him their whole lives. He was a notary public and justice of the peace, the kind of man neighbors called on to witness a deed or notarize a will, a small-town official, used to small-town business, the everyday paperwork of rural life, the quiet, unglamorous work that keeps a community running. And on this night of all nights, he was the person in the house with legal standing to administer an oath. There was no federal judge nearby, no easy way to summon anyone with greater standing before morning came. So that's exactly what he did. By his own account, written years later, Coolidge described his father climbing the stairs to wake him with the news, the old wooden steps creaking under his feet in the sleeping house, each footfall probably sounding louder than usual in that hushed, small hours' silence. The family and several others gathered downstairs in the sitting room soon after, drawn together by the weight of what had happened, standing or sitting in a room built for evening conversation and quiet company, never imagining it would host something like this. The Constitution specifies the oath a president must take, but not who must administer it, a simplicity that, on any other night, might have seemed like a minor technical detail, and on this night became the only thing that mattered. And so, gathered in that plain farmhouse room, by the light of a kerosene lamp, with the Bible that had belonged to Coolidge's mother resting on the table, A Vermont notary public prepared to swear in the 30th President of the United States, using the same simple authority he'd used countless times before for far smaller matters. The same authority he might have used the week before to notarize a neighbor's deed, now being called on for the largest task of his life. It was 2:47 in the morning. Grace Coolidge stood nearby, along with a small handful of others who happened to be present that night, including Senator Porter Dale, who had been staying a few miles away and hurried to the farmhouse after hearing the news. The room was quiet, the kind of deep, late-night quiet particular to small villages, where the nearest neighbor might be a field away and the loudest sound after dark is usually just wind or livestock, broken only by the sound of voices about to speak words that would echo far beyond that farmhouse, out past Plymouth Notch, out past Vermont, into the history of the whole country. The room was lit by a kerosene lamp, throwing long shadows across the walls of a farmhouse that had never expected to host a moment like this, a house built for the rhythms of farm life, for meals, for rest, for ordinary conversation, not for the making of presidents. Coolidge later recalled that his father's voice trembled when he woke him with the news. But when the moment came, the elder Coolidge read slowly and distinctly the same solemn oath every president recites, to faithfully execute the office, and to the best of his ability preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. His son repeated it back to him, plainly, the way he did most things, without flourish, without drama, in the same steady, understated manner for which he'd become known throughout his public life. Then it was over. The Bible had not formally been used in administering the oath, but according to one eyewitness, Coolidge's hand came to rest on it as he lowered his arm. And in that small, lamplit room, far from marble columns or crowds, far from any of the pageantry usually associated with such a transfer of power, the country had a new president, sworn in not in a grand rotunda, but in a farmhouse sitting room, by the same steady man who had notarized documents for his neighbors for years, now called on for one more piece of business, larger than any before it, yet handled with the same quiet, matter-of-fact care he brought to all the rest. There was, however, one loose thread, and it was tied up quietly rather than made into a show. A state notary swearing in a federal officer was almost certainly valid. Nothing in the Constitution forbade it, and the oath itself was the one required of any president. But questions remained in some minds about whether a state official had authority to administer the presidential oath. So 18 days later, back in Washington, with no fanfare, Coolidge had the oath quietly re-administered by federal Judge Adolph A. Hoagland, Jr. The judge was not told why, but later believed it was done to clear away any last shadow of a technical question. The incident was kept secret for years, a careful administration making sure twice that it had been done right, even when the country had already accepted that Coolidge was president. What stayed with people, though, wasn't the second oath in the Capitol, brief and procedural as it was, handled with none of the drama of that first night. It was the first one in that farmhouse. No cameras, no crowd, no ceremony built for the occasion, just a lamp, a Bible resting nearby, a family, and a father's steady voice administering the oath to his own son, in a room meant for everyday life rather than history. It's a scene that still says something true about how this country actually works, about the quiet strength built into its founding rules. That the Constitution doesn't need marble or spectacle to function. It needs ordinary people, willing to do their duty, wherever they happen to be standing when duty arrives. A notary public in a farmhouse just as much as a chief justice in a courtroom, each capable of upholding the same document, the same promise. That farmhouse still stands today in Plymouth Notch, preserved as a historic site. The table, the room, the quiet Vermont hills outside, the same sense of stillness that must have filled the air in those early morning hours when a village slept, unaware that history had just passed through one of its farmhouses. Visitors can walk in and see it for themselves, the place where, in a singular moment in American history, a father swore in his own son as President of the United States by lamplight, with his mother's Bible lying on the table, in the middle of the night, in tiny Plymouth Notch. If quiet, human moments like this one, tucked away inside the bigger story of America, are the kind you enjoy finding. Stay a while and subscribe. There are plenty more of them waiting to be told.